Now, the next, from this point, which is almost two whole blot, in other words, it's probably 2/5 of the Yeres HaKedesh, the Alter Rebbe is acting like a troubleshooter. The way I see this in Yeres HaKedesh, as I taught it to you, we've had 3 discussions so far. The first Amid, that means beginning on Kufnan Hei Amid Aleph, till 3 lines or 5 lines from the top of Kufnan Hei Amid Beis was about Tefillah. From Kufnan Hei Amid Beis at the top until Kufnan Vav at the bottom, a blot and a half, was about mitzvahs and halachas and how they're mamshech atzmos lamata. This blot, Kufnan Zayin, has discussed the juxtaposition of neshamas Yisrael and mitzvahs. Maybe you don't need mitzvahs, you have a neshama, and he explains you have to have mitzvahs anyway. Now you can have 2 more discussions. One discussion is a short one and a relatively easy one, which is today's Chitas. Beginning tomorrow, in the Shana Pshuta, which is Yud, in the Shana Moberes, it says, I think they finally converge once and for all. This is it. Tomorrow the 2 shiurim meet and it stays the home stretch, the last 8 days of Tanya, it's the same. In other words, tomorrow's Shana Pshuta is a double shiur in the Shana Moberes, and the day after tomorrow, Yud Aleph, it's already converged. It's going to start talking a very complicated pilpul in Kabbalah about how it's possible that learning halachas of mitzvahs should bring down the atmos of Elokus Lamata, l'chayra teira is eira, not kelim. The whole essay is predicated on the assumption that we're dealing with kelim. And although kelim are helam, but kelim are etzem, and the language of the Alter Rebbe we had before is it's muhus l'muhus. Remember that muhus l'muhus. Therefore, kelim of atilas that come lamata remain exactly the same. But oyer is ruchnius, and there's a tzimtzum in it. Alter Rebbe is going to pilpul how it could be that Torah, which is seichel and oyer, should have this quality of atzmos being nimshach lamata in mitzvahs. But that's tomorrow. Today's shiur asks and answers a really, really basic question. And the question that he asks is as follows. We said earlier in the second part of the Yeres HaKedesh, remember we had so far 3 sections, and this is going to be the 4th and the 5th section. The first part was about Tefillah, the first Amud. The second 3 Amudim was about mitzvahs, Yichudim, Birurim, and Amshachas Atzmos Atzilas Lamata. The last 2 shiurim were about neshamas versus mitzvahs. Now we ask the kashas. We say that when a person does a physical mitzvah, for example, you take a physical esrog, and you shake it, make a bracha, that esrog is kelim of atzilas mamish. Okay? But we say another thing. That esrog is klipa. And when you use that esrog to do a mitzvah, you are, in addition to this esrog being kelim of atzilas mamish, and you're shaking the esrog, you're also being mavada this esrog hagashmi and making it into a lakus. This is a conflict. Because when you pick up a physical esrog and you're making it into a mitzvah, you're saying it's kelim of atzilas, fine. It's one thing. But if this esrog is klipa, needs birur, wait a minute. If this esrog is klipa, needs birur, what do you mean it's godliness? And it's especially problematic when it comes to the third idea of mitzvahs. Because again, I'm sorry for the repetition, but I think it's not a bad idea to repeat myself. The sugya of mitzvahs, which starts on Kufnan Hei Amid Beis, has 3 in Yonim. Number 1, when you do mitzvahs, you're making yichudim. You're bringing Ein Sof down from Keser to Hegvuras and Echasadim, which was Chabad, and then to Zoh. Remember that discussion? The idea that when you do mitzvahs, you're bringing godliness down. No one is talking about Asiyah, no one is talking about Klipa, no one is talking about Berurim. You're bringing down Ein Sof and Tatzilas, number 1. Number 2, when you do mitzvahs, you're Mavara Berurim. You're fixing Klipas and you're giving up to Keser. And number 3, when you're doing a mitzvah, the atmos of kelim atzilas is nimshach. The Alter Rebbe says, how could the same esrog accommodate all those 3 purposes? They cancel each other out. You understood the question? We have to understand this. This is really, the way I understand it, mamish troubleshooting. It's not a hemshich to before. The Yeres HaKedesh is over. Alter Rebbe taught us what he has to taught us, but he has 2 ha'aras on this Yeres HaKedesh, which he now articulates. Today's shiur is the first, and tomorrow and the rest, Yud and Yud Aleph and Yud Beis is the second order. Again, the way I understand. The question is, Eich ha'esrik, how a esrik, which we're saying is kelim of atzilas lamata, but at the same time we're also saying shumer apach shlei nivreru adayin. It comes from klipa which has not yet been mevurer. V'haraya, it still requires birur. Correct? V'chein klafat tefillin. The same is true of leather of tefillin, which is on the one hand kelim of atzilas and asiyah. It's mitzvahs. It's going to get the kelim. Kelim is atzmos, mumhus l'mhus. But at the same time, this physical piece of leather is klipas nega. It needs to be fixed. It's a conflict. How could they affect the third union of mitzvahs, which is yichudim and atzilus, Because Atzilus has already been clarified and repaired through the Shem of Alakus called Ma Adam. We have 3 inyanim in a mitzvah. That the Gashmi is the mitzvah is Kelim of Atzilus. When you're doing a Gashmi is the mitzvah of Birurim, and you make a Yuchad in Atzilus. The first and the second, says the Alter Rebbe, I could live with. But how can I take an esrog which is still partially klipa, and by shaking it I'm making a Yuchad in Atzilus? Atzilus is Mavurir. What does Atzilus have to do with this esrog, which has still klipa in it? This is the question. And the Alter Rebbe answers with a mashal. He says, Hine, HaMashal Azehi, the example that illustrates this, is Hazriya v'Hanatiyah, when you plant a seed or you plant a tree. Shagarin, that the seed is ma'oired, it rouses. We had this earlier in Igeres HaKedesh, I don't know, Simon Zayin, Simon Ches. Ma'oired ke'ech hatzamech shavat, it rouses the power of procreation in the earth. Shudvar Hashem, which is the power of the Eibush to touch your Oretz v'gemet eitz pri v'gemet. The Eibush, through speaking the word touch your Oretz, permanently planted in the earth the ability to procreate plants from the ground. When you plant a seed, the seed does not produce the crop. The seed is ma'ed of the earth. The earth produces the crop because of the Ke'et Tzemech Shaba'aretz. Ayedei halo asman l'shoshi. How do you do it? You plant a seed. When you plant a seed, you're halo asman, you're giving a serusa d'letata that should reveal the Ke'et Tzemech on the earth, and it's going to grow. That's the mosh. Look, the kacha, the same is true in the nimshal, that when you take a physical esrog, a physical esrog may be klipa still until you finish fixing it. But the parchment and the esrog rouse adruma miles to the highest levels. Till keser, which is higher than the shviras hakelim. Which is the very, very essence of the light of ak. Not the light of ak. Like the Eibishter's name Ma, which comes from the forehead, and he's saying that Ma is only ha'ara. In other places it says the Ma has a mile of atzmos because of the infant chokmas up to but here it says it's only a ha'ara. So the atzmos of ak would be, I think it would be an ayam of ak. The inayim of ak, the eyes of ak, but I'm not sure. V'chein, and this is true not just when I do a physical mitzvah with a physical esrog, but v'limud v'iyin hilcheseyim, when I learn and I examine the halachas of the mitzvahs. Me'erid am arousing b'chinas chabad as the sfiras the kelim de zun, the chabad of the 10 sfiras of the kelim of zun of atzilus, but v'adrum amaras, much higher gamkein, which is b'chinas chabad shebesag, the level of chabad of sag, the pnimius ak, which is the pnimius. Here it says b'fedish, hayayitze derech ha'inayim v'chulu, which comes through the inayim, the eyes of ak. And therefore says Alter Rebbe, I'm mevarer birurim. When I do a mitzvah, I'm mevarer birurim. The problem is, if when I'm doing a mitzvah, I'm mevarer birurim, that means I'm dealing with an esrog which is not yet fixed. How am I going to create Yechudim and Atzilus if Yechudim and Atzilus is an issue which is above birur? It's fixed. So he says, understand, what happens when you make a birur? What happens when you make a birur? What does it make a birur? There's sparks of godliness everywhere in the world. These sparks of godliness have a source higher than Atzilus, in Keser. Keser is called Sag. But Sag has levels. There's lower levels of Sag and higher levels of Sag. The whole Shvira, and therefore the whole need for Bidur, was in a lower Madrega of Sag. When I take a physical esrog and I'm avaned it, and I'm lifting up the spark of this esrog to its root in Sag. So first of all, I touch the place in Sag, which is the source of these sparks which fell, which need to be fixed. But I also reach the Pnimius of Sag, or the Pnimius of Ak, as he calls it, which is above Bidur, and above Shvira, and above Tikkun. And therefore, because when I do Bidur, I'm reaching not just the Makar of Sag, from where the Shvira occurred, but I'm reaching a place of Sag where the Shvira never happened, and the Bidur doesn't have to be repaired, this gives the Keich from Yachaz and Yechudim. In other words, what he's saying is, that when you take a physical esrog, and you shake it, you're being mamshach kelim otilos lamatam huz mamuz. You're mavada the esrog and you're going back to the shadish, but you're also accessing a place in Sag through the bidur, which is above the iyam from Shvira and bidur altogether, and that higher point of Sag becomes the basis for the Yechudim and Atzilus. And this is accomplished both when you do a mitzvah physically as well as you learn Torah. The nekuda is every mitzvah has 3 points. I make Yechudim and Atzilus. This has nothing to do with birurim at all. Godliness comes from a higher level to a lower level. The higher level is godly, the lower level is godly, there's no clip at all. The second in mitzvah is I'm fixing klipa and I'm lifting up to its shadish, which is in kesef. And the third point is I'm bringing down kelim of atzilus and tasiyah mahus b'mahus. Alter Rebbe says, if when you're doing a mitzvah, you're mavared an esrog, which has klipa in it, how could that have to do with yichudim? Yichudim is above klipa. So the answer is because when you lift up an esrog to a shadish and birurim, you touch sag, the source of the birurim, the source of the shvira, but you also touch higher than the source of the shvira. So mitzad that when you're touching sag in the makam hashvira, your mamshech eires, that's connected to birurim. But the fact that you're touching also the einayim avak, which is above the shvira in the first place, this becomes the basis for the yichudim of atzilus, because over there there's no birur whatsoever, no shvira and therefore no birur whatsoever. And Alter Rebbe repeats again, Zakta you should know like this, v'chol anal, everything we just said, top line of Kuf Ches, we'll be saying that not only is it true when you do a physical mitzvah, you're having all these desirable effects, but also when you learn the halachas of a mitzvah. This is the biggest chiddush this against HaKadosh. That not only when you're doing a mitzvah, you're touching kelim of atzilus and you're being mamshech kelim of atzilus lamata mos b'mos, but when you learn the halachas of a mitzvah, the chayda teira eir, you're also mamshech kelim of atzilus lamata mos b'mos. But it's only when you're learning the parts of teira that have to do with halacha. But if you're learning parts of teira which have nothing to do with halacha, or even if you're learning parts of Torah that do have to do with halacha, but it's not halacha l'maaseh, it's only when you're learning about the halacha of a mitzvah that's practical. Leisa said this is not true. You learn the details of halachas of Leisa l'cha'era, particularly but those things that have never happened and most unlikely. Like the details of halachas of pigel and so forth, that since they're not realistic, halacha l'maaseh, this idea that you're reaching mahus b'mahus, the kelim of atzilus through limud Torah is not applicable. And beginning tomorrow, the next 3 shiurim, which are very difficult, the Alter Rebbe is going to be mefalpel how learning halachas, which is l'chayda Torah, and Torah is oyer, and Torah is seichel, you're also mamshech mahus of kelim of atzilus lamat.